At 6:47 a.m. on a crisp October morning in 2019, Margaret Thompson had no idea that her routine dog walk through Riverside Trail would save a man's life and expose the most shocking police corruption scandal in county history. What started as a peaceful morning with her rescued German Shepherd, Max, would become a race against time that would forever change how she viewed the thin blue line. By the end of this hour, you'll understand why sometimes the most dangerous criminals are the ones sworn to protect us, and how one woman's courage turned her into an unlikely hero in a story that reaches the highest levels of law enforcement corruption. The story I'm about to tell you involves betrayal, attempted murder, and a conspiracy that cost taxpayers millions of dollars while putting an entire community at risk. It's a story about Officer Michael Stevens, a decorated policeman who discovered something that powerful people wanted to keep buried. It's about Margaret Thompson, a 54-year-old librarian whose morning routine became a mission to save a stranger's life. And it's about the moment when doing the right thing meant risking everything. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Margaret Thompson wasn't looking for adventure when she moved to Clearwater County 3 years earlier. After her divorce from her husband of 28 years, she wanted peace, quiet, and a fresh start away from the painful memories of her failed marriage. She found exactly what she was looking for in the small town of Riverside Falls, population 8,400, where everyone knew their neighbors, and the biggest news story was usually about the annual Pumpkin Festival. Margaret rented a modest 2-bedroom house on Maple Street, close enough to walk to the public library where she worked as head librarian, far enough from the town center to enjoy the solitude she craved after years of bitter arguments and uncomfortable silences. Her daily routine was predictable and comforting. Every morning at 6:30 a.m. she would leash up Max, the 3-year-old German Shepherd she'd rescued from the county animal shelter 6 months after moving to town. Max had been returned to the shelter twice by previous owners who couldn't handle his high energy and protective instincts, but Margaret saw something special in his intelligent brown eyes. Together, they would walk the same 3-mile loop through Riverside Trail, a well-maintained hiking path that wound through dense pine forests and alongside the rushing waters of Clear Creek. For Margaret, these morning walks weren't just exercise. They were meditation, a chance to prepare for the day ahead while enjoying the natural beauty that surrounded their small town. Officer Michael Stevens had been walking a different kind of beat for the past 14 years. At 42 years old, he was exactly the kind of police officer every community hoped to have protecting their streets. Born and raised in Clearwater County, Michael knew every family, every business owner, and every troubled teenager who might need guidance rather than arrest. He coached Little League baseball in the summers, volunteered at the food bank during holidays, and had never drawn his weapon in the line of duty until the night that changed everything. Michael was married to his high school sweetheart Jennifer, and they had 2 daughters, Emma and Sophie, ages 12 and 10, who thought their father was the bravest man in the world. What Emma and Sophie didn't know was that their father had been losing sleep for months over something he'd discovered at work. It started innocently enough in June 2019, when Michael was helping organize files in the evidence storage room. As the department's most senior patrol officer, he often assisted with administrative tasks during quiet shifts, and evidence organization was one of those mundane but necessary jobs that fell to experienced officers. While cataloging drug seizures from recent arrests, Michael noticed something that didn't add up. According to the paperwork, a major bust from February had yielded 15 kilograms of cocaine, but the evidence locker only contained 8 kilograms. When he brought the discrepancy to his supervisor, Sergeant David Walsh, he was told it was probably a clerical error and that he shouldn't worry about it. But Michael Stevens was the kind of man who worried about details, especially when those details involved evidence that could make or break criminal cases. Over the following weeks, he began quietly reviewing other drug seizure reports, cross-referencing them with evidence room inventories during his off hours. What he found kept him awake at night. Over the past 2 years, more than $2.8 million worth of seized drugs had gone missing from evidence storage. Cocaine, heroin, methamphetamine, and fentanyl had all disappeared without proper documentation, and in each case, The supervising officer on the seizure report was either Sergeant Walsh or Lieutenant Robert Kane, the second highest ranking officer in the department. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental and too widespread to be the work of one person. Michael realized he was looking at evidence of a systematic operation that involved multiple officers and had been running for years. Even more troubling, when he compared the missing evidence to court records, he discovered that several major drug dealers had received surprisingly light sentences despite being caught with large quantities of narcotics. The missing drugs corresponded exactly to cases where defendants had received plea deals that seemed too good to be true. Someone was stealing evidence and possibly selling it back to the same criminals who had been arrested with it in the first place. By September 2019, Michael had documented 17 separate incidents where evidence had gone missing under suspicious circumstances. He had photocopied police reports, evidence logs, and court records, creating a file that painted a clear picture of corruption reaching high into the department hierarchy. He knew that bringing these allegations forward would end careers and possibly result in criminal charges against fellow officers, some of whom he had worked alongside for over a decade. But Michael Stevens had sworn an oath to serve and protect, and he couldn't ignore evidence of crimes being committed by the very people entrusted to uphold the law. On October 10, 2019, Michael made the decision that would nearly cost him his life. He called Internal Affairs and requested a meeting to discuss concerns about evidence handling procedures in his department. The appointment was scheduled for October 16th, giving him 6 days to organize his documentation and prepare for what he knew would be the most difficult conversation of his career. What Michael didn't know was that his phone call had been overheard by the wrong person, and that his request for an Internal Affairs meeting had been reported to the very officers he was preparing to expose. Lieutenant Robert Kane had been a police officer for 23 years, and in that time he had developed expensive tastes that his government salary couldn't support. His gambling addiction had started small weekend trips to Atlantic City with friends from the department, but it had gradually consumed his life and his finances. By 2017, Kane owed more than $180,000 to bookmakers and loan sharks who weren't interested in hearing excuses about public servant salaries. When Sergeant Walsh approached him with a proposal to supplement their income through creative evidence management, Kane saw it as his only way out of financial ruin. The operation was surprisingly simple and had been running smoothly for over 2 years. When major drug busts occurred, Walsh and Kane would ensure they were assigned as supervising officers. After the drugs were processed and logged into evidence, they would systematically remove portions of the seized narcotics, replacing the missing weight with baking soda or other harmless substances. The stolen drugs were then sold through intermediaries to dealers in neighboring counties, generating substantial profits that were split between the corrupt officers and used to pay down Kane's gambling debts. Over 2 years, they had stolen and resold more than 50 kilograms of various narcotics, earning nearly $400,000 in illegal profits. The system worked because very few people had access to the evidence room, and fewer still had reason to conduct detailed audits of drug seizures. Most evidence remained untouched until trial dates, and by then, defense attorneys rarely requested independent testing of seized substances. Walsh and Kane had been careful to only target cases where defendants were likely to accept plea deals, reducing the chances that missing drugs would be discovered during trial preparation. They had also cultivated relationships with certain defense attorneys who were willing to encourage their clients to accept favorable plea agreements in exchange for undisclosed considerations. When Kane learned about Michael Stevens' appointment with Internal Affairs, he knew their profitable operation was about to be exposed. A thorough investigation would reveal not only the missing drugs, but also the financial records showing unexplained income deposits into Walsh's and Kane's bank accounts. Both men faced the prospect of criminal charges, lengthy prison sentences, and the loss of their pensions and benefits. Kane had too much to lose and too many dangerous creditors to risk exposure. He convinced Walsh that they had only one option to protect themselves and their families from the consequences of their crimes. The plan they developed was designed to look like a random attack on a police officer, the kind of tragic incident that occurred periodically in communities across the country. Kane would use his authority as a lieutenant to assign Michael to a routine patrol in a remote area outside town, where cell phone coverage was spotty, and backup would be slow to arrive. Walsh would arrange for a fake emergency call that would lure Michael to an isolated location, and then they would stage an ambush that would eliminate the threat to their operation, while generating sympathy for the department and deflecting attention from any internal investigation. On the evening of October 14, 2019, Lieutenant Kane assigned Michael Stevens to patrol the Eastern District, an area that included several miles of rural roads and wooded areas where drug activity had been reported in recent weeks. Kane told Michael that intelligence suggested dealers were using remote locations to conduct transactions away from the more heavily patrolled areas of town, and that increased patrol presence in the Eastern District might disrupt their operations. Michael accepted the assignment without question, unaware that he was being positioned for an attack that his colleagues hoped would solve their corruption problem permanently. At 2:15 a.m. on October 15th, Michael received a radio call reporting suspicious activity at an abandoned hunting cabin located 3 miles down a dirt access road in the state forest. The caller claimed to have seen vehicles and flashlights around the property, suggesting possible drug activity or vandalism. Michael radioed his location and headed toward the cabin, following standard procedure for investigating reports of suspicious activity in remote areas. What he didn't know was that the call had come from an untraceable cell phone purchased specifically for this operation, and that Walsh and Kane were already positioned along the access road, waiting for him to arrive. The hunting cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense pine forest, accessible only by the narrow dirt road that wound through the trees for nearly a mile before reaching the property. Michael's patrol car headlights cut through the darkness as he navigated the rutted access road, scanning the forest on both sides for any sign of the suspicious activity that had been reported. When he reached the cabin, he found no evidence of recent human presence, no tire tracks in the dirt clearing, and no indication that anyone had been on the property recently. He was about to radio in an all-clear report when he heard movement in the forest behind him. Michael turned toward the sound and saw 2 figures emerging from the tree line, both wearing dark clothing and carrying what appeared to be firearms. In the split second before he recognized Walsh and Kane, Michael's training kicked in and he reached for his weapon, but he was too late. The first shot hit him in the chest, and although his bulletproof vest absorbed most of the impact, the force knocked him backward against his patrol car. The second shot caught him in the abdomen below his vest, and Michael felt the burning pain of a serious wound as he dropped to his knees behind the vehicle. Kane and Walsh approached the fallen officer, believing they had successfully eliminated the threat to their operation. They could see blood spreading across Michael's uniform shirt, and his labored breathing suggested he had sustained life-threatening injuries. Kane checked Michael's pulse and found it weak and irregular, confirming that he was dying from blood loss and internal damage. Satisfied that their problem had been solved, Kane and Walsh dragged Michael's unconscious body into the forest, leaving him approximately 200 yards from the access road where they believed he would die undetected and undiscovered for days or weeks. What Kane and Walsh didn't realize was that Michael Stevens possessed the kind of determination and survival instinct that had made him an effective police officer for 14 years. Despite his serious injuries, Michael remained conscious enough to understand his situation and his attackers' intentions. As soon as he heard their vehicles driving away, Michael began the agonizing process of crawling through the forest toward Riverside Trail, knowing that the popular hiking path offered his only chance of being found by someone who could summon help. Every movement sent waves of pain through his wounded body, but Michael forced himself to keep moving, driven by thoughts of his wife and daughters who were sleeping peacefully at home, unaware that their husband and father was fighting for his life in the cold October darkness. The distance from where Michael had been left to die to Riverside Trail was approximately 400 yards through dense forest, rocky terrain, and thick underbrush. For a healthy person, it would have been a difficult hike requiring careful navigation and physical stamina. For a man bleeding internally from a gunshot wound, it represented an almost impossible challenge that would test the limits of human endurance and willpower. Michael crawled on his hands and knees, pausing frequently to rest and fight waves of dizziness caused by blood loss. using the North Star to maintain his direction toward the trail he knew Margaret Thompson and other early morning walkers used every day. By dawn, Michael had managed to crawl approximately 300 yards from his starting point, but his strength was failing rapidly, and he could feel his consciousness slipping away. He had lost substantial amounts of blood, his body temperature was dropping dangerously low, and dehydration was beginning to affect his mental clarity. Michael knew he was dying, but he also knew he was close to the trail where someone might find him if he could just make it a little farther. With his remaining strength, he pulled himself behind a fallen log where he would be visible to anyone walking on the main path, and then he waited for either rescue or death, whichever came first. Margaret Thompson woke up at 6:15 a.m. on October 15th, just as she had every morning for the past 3 years. She made coffee, checked the weather forecast, and prepared Max's leash and water bottle for their morning walk. The October air was crisp and clear, perfect for hiking, and Margaret looked forward to the peaceful hour she would spend in the forest before beginning another day at the library. She had no way of knowing that her routine morning walk was about to become the most important hour of her life, or that a stranger's survival depended on her willingness to help someone in desperate need. At exactly 6:30 a.m., Margaret and Max left her house on Maple Street and walked the 4 blocks to the trailhead at Riverside Park. The trail was deserted at this early hour, which was exactly how Margaret preferred it. She enjoyed the solitude and the opportunity to think without distraction, while Max explored the fascinating scents that filled the forest air. They followed their usual route along the main trail, staying on the well-maintained path that park rangers kept clear of fallen trees and overgrown vegetation. Margaret had walked this trail hundreds of times and knew every landmark, every turn, and every seasonal change in the forest ecosystem. About 20 minutes into their walk, at approximately 6:47 a.m., Max suddenly stopped and began exhibiting behavior that Margaret had never seen before. The normally obedient dog pulled hard on his leash, whining and pawing at the ground while looking toward a dense section of forest off the main trail. When Margaret tried to redirect him back to the path, Max became increasingly agitated, barking and refusing to move forward. Margaret's first thought was that Max had detected a wild animal, possibly a deer or bear, but his behavior seemed different from his usual reaction to wildlife encounters. Margaret decided to investigate what was causing Max's unusual behavior, and she allowed him to lead her approximately 50 yards off the main trail into a section of forest she had never explored. The undergrowth was thick and difficult to navigate, and Margaret was beginning to think they should return to the trail when Max suddenly stopped beside a fallen log and began barking frantically. At first, Margaret couldn't see anything unusual, but as she moved closer to the log, she noticed what appeared to be a boot protruding from behind the fallen tree. When Margaret walked around the log to investigate, she discovered Officer Michael Stevens lying unconscious in a pool of blood, wearing his police uniform and duty belt. Michael was barely breathing. His skin was pale and cold to the touch, and blood was still seeping from what appeared to be a serious wound in his abdomen. Margaret immediately recognized that Michael was critically injured and would die without immediate medical attention, but she also realized that her cell phone had no signal in this remote section of forest, and that running back to town for help would take at least 30 minutes. Margaret Thompson made a decision that would save Michael Stevens's life, and ultimately expose the corruption that had nearly killed him. Drawing on her experience as a volunteer with the local Red Cross, Margaret began administering basic first aid while instructing Max to stay with the injured officer. She used her jacket to apply pressure to Michael's abdominal wound, elevating his legs to help maintain blood pressure, and talking to him constantly to keep him conscious and aware of her presence. Margaret knew that Michael's survival depended on getting professional medical help as quickly as possible, but she also knew that leaving him alone could result in his death from blood loss or exposure. After stabilizing Michael as much as possible with her limited resources, Margaret made the difficult decision to leave Max with the injured officer, while she ran back to the main trail to search for other hikers or joggers who might have cell phone service or be able to summon help. Max seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and positioned himself next to Michael, providing warmth and comfort, while Margaret began the desperate race to find assistance. As she ran back toward the trail, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that Michael's injuries were too severe and too precisely located to be the result of an accident, and she began to suspect that someone had deliberately tried to kill the police officer she was trying to save. Margaret reached the main trail and began running toward town, hoping to encounter other early morning exercisers who might be able to help. After running for approximately 10 minutes, she met Tom Wilson, a retired teacher who jogged the trail every morning before work. Tom had a cell phone with full signal strength, and he immediately called 911 to report the discovery of a critically injured police officer in the forest. While Tom remained on the phone with emergency dispatchers, Margaret led him back to Michael's location, where they found Max still guarding the unconscious officer and providing crucial body heat that was helping to prevent potentially fatal hypothermia. The first ambulance arrived at the scene within 25 minutes of Tom's 911 call, followed closely by additional emergency medical personnel and police officers from multiple agencies. Paramedics immediately began advanced life support procedures, establishing intravenous lines to replace Michael's lost blood volume and administering medications to stabilize his blood pressure and heart rate. The senior paramedic on scene later told investigators that Michael Stevens was within minutes of death when they found him, and that Margaret Thompson's first aid efforts had almost certainly saved his life by slowing the bleeding and keeping him warm during the critical period before professional help arrived. Michael Stevens was transported by helicopter to Regional Medical Center, where trauma surgeons worked for 6 hours to repair the damage caused by his gunshot wound. The bullet had missed major organs but had caused significant internal bleeding and tissue damage that required multiple surgical procedures to address completely. During his surgery, investigators began processing the crime scene where Michael had been found, searching for evidence that might identify his attackers and explain how a police officer had ended up dying in the forest, miles from any road or populated area. The investigation initially focused on the possibility that Michael had been attacked by someone he had arrested or investigated, but this theory became less plausible as detectives learned more about the circumstances surrounding the shooting. Michael's patrol car was found at the abandoned hunting cabin, but there was no evidence of a struggle at that location, and the blood trail led investigators to conclude that Michael had been shot elsewhere and had somehow managed to crawl through the forest to the location where Margaret found him. The discovery that Michael had been investigating evidence room discrepancies added a new dimension to the case and raised the possibility that his shooting was connected to internal police department issues rather than external criminal threats. As Michael began his slow recovery in the hospital's intensive care unit, investigators discovered that he had compiled extensive documentation of missing evidence and suspicious activities within his own department. The files Michael had prepared for his internal affairs meeting provided a roadmap for investigating potential corruption, and federal agents were called in to conduct an independent review of the allegations he had uncovered. What they found exceeded even Michael's suspicions about the scope and duration of the criminal activities being conducted by his fellow officers. The federal investigation revealed that Kane and Walsh had stolen and resold more than $2.8 million worth of seized drugs over a period of 3 years, using their positions of authority to access evidence storage and manipulate documentation to cover their tracks. Bank records showed unexplained cash deposits totaling more than $400,000 in Kane's personal accounts, while Walsh had used stolen drug proceeds to purchase a new boat, expensive jewelry, and other luxury items that were far beyond his means as a police sergeant. Both men had also been providing information to defense attorneys about pending cases in exchange for additional payments, compromising multiple prosecutions, and allowing dangerous criminals to receive reduced sentences. The attempted murder of Michael Stevens was the final desperate act of criminals who knew their illegal operation was about to be exposed, and who believed that eliminating the one honest officer who had discovered their activities would allow them to continue stealing with impunity. Kane and Walsh had underestimated both Michael's determination to survive and Margaret Thompson's willingness to risk her own safety to help a stranger in need. Their careful planning had been undone by the courage and compassion of an ordinary citizen who happened to be in the right place at the right time, with the right instincts to save a life. The arrest of Kane and Walsh sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community, and prompted a comprehensive review of evidence handling procedures in police departments throughout the region. Both men eventually pleaded guilty to federal corruption charges, attempted murder, and racketeering, receiving prison sentences of 25 and 30 years respectively. The investigation also led to the indictment of 3 defense attorneys and 2 drug dealers who had participated in the conspiracy, demonstrating the widespread nature of the criminal network that Michael's honesty had exposed. Margaret Thompson became a reluctant hero in the aftermath of Michael's rescue, receiving recognition from the governor, the FBI, and multiple law enforcement agencies for her life-saving actions. She used her newfound public platform to advocate for police accountability and citizen involvement in community safety, arguing that ordinary people have both the ability and the responsibility to help their neighbors in times of crisis. Margaret's actions had not only saved Michael Stevens's life, but had also exposed a criminal conspiracy that had been operating undetected for years, protecting her community from corrupt officers who had betrayed their oath to serve and protect. Michael Stevens returned to active duty after 6 months of recovery and rehabilitation, but he requested a transfer to Internal Affairs where he could continue investigating police misconduct and ensuring that no other honest officers would face the kind of betrayal he had experienced. His near-death experience had reinforced his commitment to integrity and accountability in law enforcement, and he became a powerful advocate for transparency and ethical conduct within his profession. Michael credited Margaret Thompson with saving not only his life, but also his faith in the basic human decency that makes community policing possible. The case of Michael Stevens and Margaret Thompson demonstrates that heroism is not limited to people who wear badges or carry weapons, but can be found in ordinary citizens who choose to act when they encounter someone in need of help. Margaret's decision to investigate Max's unusual behavior, to provide first aid to a stranger, and to persist in her efforts to summon help had consequences that extended far beyond saving one man's life. Her actions exposed corruption, protected the community from criminal officers, and reminded everyone involved that the best defense against wrongdoing is often the courage of individuals who refuse to look the other way when they witness injustice. Today, Michael Stevens continues his work in Internal Affairs, where he has been instrumental in implementing new procedures designed to prevent the kind of evidence tampering that nearly cost him his life. Margaret Thompson still walks Riverside Trail every morning with Max, who has become something of a local celebrity for his role in discovering the wounded officer. The trail now features a small memorial marker at the location where Michael was found, honoring both his service and Margaret's heroism, and reminding visitors that extraordinary acts of courage can happen anywhere, performed by anyone who chooses to help, rather than walk away when faced with another person's desperate need for assistance. What would you have done in Margaret's place? Let us know in the comments, because sometimes the right thing isn't the easy thing. And if this story moved you, hit subscribe to uncover more true stories of courage, betrayal, and justice.